And I was just very lucky. I was on an employment training scheme, and I met somebody who was just taking a Maths O level at night school so she could go off and teach English. And she was the first adult who'd ever spoken to me and said, "You're intelligent." And that had such a transformative effect on my understanding of who I was. The fact that somebody was positive.
Hey, welcome back to Adventures in Learning Design, a place to talk about how to design effective learning experiences. My name's Laurie Harrison.
And my name's Laura Patsko, and we're from LearnJam, a purpose-driven learning agency and consultancy.
And in this episode, Laura and I spoke to Martin Bloomfield. You may remember that Tim and I spoke to Martin back in season 1 when we talked about dyslexia and learning design. Quick recap though, Martin is a teacher trainer and a consultant in international communication skills, and he's also an expert in dyslexia awareness, autism awareness, ethics and language training. And we wanted to talk to Martin about the first of the ILXD, or Inclusive Learning Experience Design, dimensions. And that first dimension is the learner or the individual. Welcome back to Adventures in Learning Design. Martin, it's great to have you back on the podcast.
Absolute pleasure to be here. Genuinely, it really is.
Excellent. Well, you were responsible for, in my opinion, the most interesting conversation that we had in season 1 of the podcast. So genuinely very excited to have you back on.
So no pressure.
No pressure at all. No. You've got a lot to live up to. Martin, could you just tell us a little bit, I guess, as a recap about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, sure. I work for a few companies. I work for a company called York Associates in York, and we train people in international communication skills. I run a project called Dyslexia Bites, which is, as much as anything else, an information portal about dyslexia from an intercultural perspective. And I work in various universities up and down Europe, training people in dyslexia awareness, neurodiversity awareness, and ethics.
Mm.
Fascinating stuff. Well summarized. I've got so many questions already. This is part of season 2. We're going to be talking about the different dimensions of inclusive learning design. And we've invited you, Martin, because you've got some fascinating insights to share, I don't doubt. And we're going to talk first about the learner themselves. I think people often who aren't so experienced in learning design think that, you create some material and then that material gets used by people and that's how they learn. But obviously the learner themselves brings a lot to the experience. And so we thought it'd be really useful to talk to you about your background in working with learners from a variety of backgrounds with a variety of abilities and needs and preferences. And so what is it about the learner themselves that can affect their experience of learning?
Well, one of the things, of course, is one of the things that I specialize in, which is neurodiversity. So what we have to understand about neurodiversity is that it is what it says on the tin. It's neurological. It's to do with the brain. It's to do with the neurons. It's to do with nerves. It's to do with how your brain is built. And this is really key because once we accept that a neurodiverse brain, such as a dyslexic brain, is physically built slightly differently from what is laughably called a neurotypical brain, a non-dyslexic brain, then we have to start to understand something. So when we talk, for instance, about something such as rationality or right thinking, what we're effectively doing is we're talking about how we process information. But as the British Dyslexia Association defines dyslexia, it's about how you process information differently. And so the very concept of rationality, the very concept of right thinking becomes slightly changed when we start thinking about dyslexic brains. And so it's not simply about, dyslexics, they read slowly or something like that. When the brain is seen to be built differently, when, to put it in very brutish terms, the synapses are pointing in different directions, information will be processed differently. And when information is processed differently, that means that, if you like, the whole concept of rationality and right thinking has to be re-examined. There was a philosopher called Richard Bernstein. There's a civil rights activist and a philosopher called Cornel West, and there was a philanthropist anthropologist, not a philanthropist, an anthropologist called Peter Winch. And in different ways, they each talk about something called regimes of truth, or they talk about forms or modes of rationality. It's fairly well accepted that rationality is, in one sense at the very least, culturally relative. And therefore, the ideas and the modes that we have of rationality are not necessary. There are other ways of being rational. It's not that our way is wrong. We shan't throw the baby out with the bathwater. But there are different understandings of rationality in different cultures and different epochs. And once we grasp that, then we start to widen out and broaden out our understanding of what thinking is, what processing information is, and indeed what learning can be.
Wow. So Martin, straight in, super deep into what we even mean by thinking, and how we can take for granted that certain things are rational or right thinking even. And that's something we need to be looking at. If we can expand our understanding of what we mean by thinking, then we can expand our understanding of what learning is or what learning can be.
And this is fascinating because I think from a learning design perspective, when you're putting together an experience that will be, let's say, traveled through by many people with different neurological backgrounds, needs, and so on, different cultural backgrounds, it's really difficult to assume any commonality. So in thinking in terms of what the learners themselves bring to a learning experience, how do we deal with this huge diversity in practical terms? What do you think are the main challenges and the main opportunities?
One of the things we need to do, and I know this sounds a little bit meta, it sounds a little bit philosophical, it sounds a little bit culturalist, but one of the things we have to do is, I always advise that we turn to theorists such as the American cultural theorist Edgar Schein. Now, I'm going to simplify what he said very simply, but Edgar Schein talked about 3 effectively concentric circles to what a culture is. The outside circle are the artifacts and the behaviors of a culture. That is what we do, effectively, what we wear, how we go about our business. The middle circle is the values, which include the ethics, and they include things like what we hold to be dear, politeness, those things. The inner circle, this is the really interesting one. This is the norms and the unspoken assumptions. And the norms and the unspoken assumptions are what underlie the very notion of what it is to learn. They're what underlie the very notion of what it is to think straight. They're what underline the very notion of what something could be that could be called, for instance, moral or ethical or rational or something like that. And so when we start looking at these underlying norms and assumptions, that's when we start to get to the heart of what it might be that we're doing without even thinking about it. Because let's be honest, almost every educator you meet is a good person. Almost every educator you meet is really, really doing their very best to help people. And yet, what's going on? Why is it that at least 15% of the population, that's the dyslexic part of the population, and then maybe other neurodivergent sections of the population, what is it that's continuing to fail these people? Did you get what I said without the beat, without the ding-dongs?
I think so. A little ding-dong in the background's fine.
Excellent. the ding-demic, I think that's what it
call it. So Martin's painted this somewhat unfortunate picture that we have good, dedicated educators who are letting down a significant proportion of learners, and that's partly or maybe even largely due to unquestioning assumptions about how we think and how we learn. So let's try and move the conversation on to, well, as learning designers, what can we do about that?
Do stop me. I did wonder whether I went a little meta at that point, so please stop me.
Maybe this is kind of, my instinct was, that's really interesting. Now let's kind of step back again and unpack it a bit.
Yeah.
So maybe that might be a good place to go.
Absolutely.
Because you've already there's a lot in there, isn't there? So okay, let's explode that a bit.
Thank you so much, Martin. I feel like in every sentence you say, there's so much to unpack, and I can wholly understand now why Tim and Laurie were saying that the episode you recorded with us before was so rich and mind-blowing.
Yeah.
I feel I should apologize.
No, please don't apologize.
No.
Never apologize for provoking thought like that. It's this is why we're here, you know? I think what I'm trying to do is understand how to begin tackling this reality, because I think what often happens in not just learning experience design, but any field where you begin to understand just how diverse we all are as individuals and how we have these influences. You were referring to concentric circles, but you know, the influence of our background, our culture, our assumptions transcends different aspects of life, not just learning. And what I'm thinking now is, how do we address these things practically so that we all can learn and work and live together happily and effectively and so on? Because I think it's very tempting to sort of ignore those differences and that diversity because it's so overwhelming, it's so complicated, it's so rich, it's so mind-blowing. It's easy to think, well, let's just design for sort of the normal learner. But, you know, what is normal? There's no such thing. So what I'm trying to do in my mind as you say these things is think, well, where to begin? You know, what can we do practically that can at least give everybody a way in? And then when they're in this learning experience, how can we work together in, as I say, a very practical way so that they get a benefit, that people really do learn. They're not just sort of turning up and then finding, well, I don't get anything out of this. So I suppose that's a kind of a woolly question for you, but you know, where to begin in order to ensure that everybody gets to participate? Can you suggest any sort of tips? What do we do with this diversity?
It's not a woolly question at all. It's a perfectly well-focused question. So effectively, what we can do is we can take the cookie dough of education, we can cut it as we like. So what I'm now going to do is I'm going to say, well, in this regard, I'm going to cut the cookie dough in two ways. There's our input in education, and there's the output of the people we're educating. And so that's two ways of looking at it. And what we have to do is we have to look at what we're doing with our input and what we're demanding from the output. So the output is really fascinating. When I was at school, and I know that we're not necessarily talking about school, but let's just take that as a paradigm example of education. When I was at school, and I talk to educators quite a lot, and they will basically confirm that the same thing is going on. When I was at school, we were tested on our ability to effectively recall the information we were given and to apply this information we were given in ways that show that we understand it. So we were basically examined on our ability to recall information and apply that information to show that we understand it. If, however, you go to something as basic as our understanding of what learning is by looking at Bloom's taxonomy, you'll notice that these three things, understanding, remembering, and applying, are at the bottom of Bloom's taxonomy. They are what they're effectively called the LOTS, the lower order thinking strategies, or the lower order thinking skills. What we're not doing is we're not examining kids on the higher order thinking skills, the higher order thinking strategies. We're not examining them on the creativity. We're not necessarily examining them on the ability to analyze, to evaluate, to prioritize, to compare and contrast, and to create something new. In other words, if we're examining the kids on the lower order thinking strategies, not the higher order thinking strategies, in one respect, at the very least, we're examining kids on what learning isn't rather than on what learning is. Now, interestingly, what we also realize is that when we look at dyslexic people have, almost all of us have poor working memory. And that's the ability to recall and to apply. So effectively, what we're being tested on is that thing which our brain doesn't let us do. And this is a really important point, because I've just submitted my doctoral thesis.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I submitted it two weeks ago, and I hope to be successful. But if you put me in an exam hall now and ask me to do a standard exam, I would fail. I can tell you that now. I would guarantee it now. And so what's happening is, I'm not saying, hey, I'm really clever, but what I am saying is the failure that I went through at school clearly doesn't reflect my ability to do so. It just reflects the way that they examine and test kids when they're at
Mm-hmm.
school. And so
Mm-hmm.
what we need to do is we need to understand what brains do. And we know that dyslexic brains have trouble recalling and applying. We know this because we know the working memory problems that dyslexic brains
Mm-hmm.
have.
Mm-hmm.
We also know, for instance, that dyslexic brains are really good at evaluating and creating. And when I say
So,
that, I'm not just being kind. There's study upon study upon study that show this. And so
right,
when
right. So, in terms of a practical tip of how to deal with diversity, that makes it sound like a problem. What I mean is that the reality is that every person is different, and neurodiversity is actually just the way of the world. It's not a category of learner. So, what I mean is, in practical terms, what you're suggesting is that we don't simply assess lower order thinking skills. We don't simply teach in a way that requires working memory or recall, but we should also address things like evaluating and analyzing and creative applications of knowledge, because then that captures the abilities of a wider range of learners. Is that fair to
It
say?
does. Absolutely, it does. And it also shows that by simply examining the lower order thinking skills, it shows that our ambition is really limited, because and the way that we look at the kids is really limited. You know, we could look at them as able to do the higher order thinking skills if we wanted to. And it also means that what we shouldn't do is we shouldn't assume that learning is the same for everyone. That's the key.
Mm-hmm.
Different people learn differently.
So if different people learn differently, then that's something that we as learning designers need to factor into every decision that we make. And it's not just about learning materials or learning experiences, it's also about assessment. What are we looking for as signs or indications that someone has learned something successfully?
Do you think we're going to talk about assessment in the materials and content dimension of inclusive learning design, which is a different episode of the podcast, so I don't want to dwell on it. But something that you're suggesting to me here, it makes me wonder if the reason that these lower order thinking skills tend to be assessed more is because they're easier to measure, or perceived to be easier to measure. And therefore, if we want to point at a learner and say they have learned something, it's easier to count up, oh, they remembered 5 out of 6 facts, than it is to count up or measure they were able to evaluate, they were able to analyze. Is that your experience or your understanding as well?
100%, 100%. And in fact, throughout most of education, when we ask educators, why do we do this and why don't we do this? The answer they usually give is this is easier, or it's too difficult.
Easier, right?
what they could be saying is this is easier for us, or this is too difficult for us. And as soon as we realize that that's the sentence they're really saying, then we realize that actually education has become for the educators rather than for the educated.
That's
and
a beautiful
so
insight.
as soon as anybody says this is too hard for us, then they've got education upside down.
That to me is the most beautiful thing I've heard in learning design in a long time. Because what you've just done is you've just explained, even as we talk about the difference between a phrase like learning design or learning experience design, who are we thinking about? Are we thinking about the person designing it, the person instructing, or are we thinking about the person experiencing that, the person learning? So actually, even our choice of words and how we describe what we do is really important. You've just really pinpointed something for me that I think has been sort of there in the back of my mind for a while. Thank you for summarizing that so articulately. So how could we frame it differently?
We have to be honest with ourselves. We have to actually ask what we mean. I mean that this is the easiest way to examine people for me. That's what I mean.
It would be too difficult for us. That's the complete sentence. And from that point, we can start to solve the real problem. Yeah.
They got education upside down. That's quite a strong statement, isn't it? The implication that so many decisions are being made for the benefit of educators rather than for learners themselves.
I want to bring us back to the learner, which is our focus today, because a lot of what you're saying feels very familiar to me. I suppose I'm quite privileged, not from a lot of my own experience of formal education, but from people that I know and certainly people that I've taught. And thinking about the learner themselves, in our understanding at LearnJam of the influence of the learner on a learning experience, we often conceptualize it at different levels. So we think of the very specific level of kind of what is in the learner's physical mind and body, things like their mental abilities or capacity, any specific learning difficulties they have, things like their physical abilities and capacity, or any support needs like mobility, visual impairment, fatigue or stress or anything like that. That's the kind of very specific low level, not low level in quality, but the very center of the learner. And then we can kind of think, actually, how does the learner bring an influence at a bigger picture level, like their attitudes towards learning, their motivation to learn. And at an even higher level than that, a kind of meta level, so not just affecting their experience of learning, but their whole life experience, things like their personal beliefs or whether they like or trust the learning provider, their general self-efficacy. And I mentioned these different levels of influence because I think it's coming back to this idea of like what's easier to design for, what's more difficult. I think we often focus on the low level, the very granular, can this person, is this person literate? Can they read the learning material? Or does this person have mobility needs and the school should be designed in a way that everybody physically can access? What we often don't think about are these higher level things like motivation and self-efficacy. And a lot of what you're describing to me in the learner's experience seems like it could actually have a really powerful impact on whether somebody feels themselves able to learn.
There is no such thing as dyslexia. There are dyslexic people. This is a human issue. As soon as we look at it as human beings, then we stop, as it were, abstracting them from what's going on. And when we say, oh, this person finds it difficult to read, imagine you're a language teacher for a second. Or, so imagine you're in an intercultural environment and there's somebody with what we would sort of hierarchically call a low level of English. Well, what's our attitude to that person? Is our attitude to that person can't speak? Or is our attitude to that person, okay, how do we communicate with this person? And when we start asking that question about learners as well, it's not that person can't, it's how do we? Then it becomes a slightly different question. And that, yes, what we shouldn't do is we shouldn't focus on these obvious things. As you say, like, well, we shouldn't focus on somebody's abilities or inabilities because that's kind of the wrong narrative. Because
or
you
not
wouldn't do that if you
exclusively
were communicating.
not
like, exclusively,
insofar as it may have an impact on their ability to access a learning experience, it's important, but it's not the whole thing. It's not only that level of influence that we should consider.
What are, as you say, this person's motivations? So we recently had A-level results coming out, and people were focusing on the success of A stars and double A stars, but actually somebody getting a C, that could have been real success for that person. What is it for something to be successful? Why do we only focus on, as it were, the typical student getting a typical result? Judged as successful by our typical standards. Why don't we understand what success could be judged by through somebody else's eyes? What's the motivation? What's the need? What's the desire?
This exam that you mentioned, A-levels, so this is the school leaving exam in the UK or in England and Wales, certainly around age 17, 18, which is a very important age for our development of our self-esteem, our self-worth, our the way that we see ourselves as, the age that many people will leave formal education. Will they consider learning in future? If what you're saying is true, if the emphasis in society and culture is often on kind of the highest grades rather than the relative achievement of an individual learner, how do you think that can affect them going forward in their experience of learning in terms of things like motivation and self-efficacy and setting aside time to learn? If you were to leave school with a C, which was a huge achievement for you, but that was portrayed generally in public as a low achievement because everybody wants an A, that's a higher grade, what impact can that have on the learner as they go into future learning experiences?
So when I left school after doing my A-levels at 19, so I was a year or a year and a half after other people, because I'd been held back a little bit a couple of times. When I left school after my A-levels with 2 C's and a D, I became almost irreparably unemployable for about 3 years. I had an issue with any form of authority. I kept getting sacked from the very low-level jobs I had. And we're talking about jobs such as licking stamps and putting them on envelopes. That was the type of job that I was doing. And I genuinely believed that I could not. And I'd been told throughout my entire school life that I couldn't. And this is really important, because it's not simply about the exams at the end. And if we focus on the exam at the end, then we miss the stuff that leads up to the exam at the end. If I'm a slow reader, then I'm a slow reader in absolutely everything, and I'm falling behind in absolutely everything, in geography, in English. And not only am I falling behind in these little elements of learning, but it builds up. So if I'm learning one piece of unit per lesson, sorry, one learning unit per lesson, and everybody else is learning 3 learning units per lesson, then over a school year, the difference at the end of how much I've learned and how much they've learned is enormous. And it
Because the
might not be
effect
my
is
fault.
cumulative, so it builds
The
up
effect is
over that course
cumulative.
of the year.
Absolutely. And it's
And
not
then
my
after
fault.
the
It's
year,
just that's not how I learn. Yeah. And at the end of the year, then I'm not prepared for the next year, because I haven't reached these standards that everybody has set for me, because those standards are easier for them. And so by the time you get to it, you have gone through a lifetime in your most vulnerable formative years. You've gone through a lifetime of being told you're a failure in various forms or another. And that can be simply your marks, it can be the grades at the end of the year, it can be your teachers telling you should try harder, it should be all of these things. And so what does it do to you psychologically? It crushes you.
Right.
Absolutely crushes you.
We know that Martin was eventually able to move from feeling crushed to becoming someone who loves learning and has made it an integral part of his life for many years. So we wanted to find out more about how that change was able to happen.
But so what is surprising then, not in the way that you framed it, surprising, but as we know, not impossible, because here you are in front of us. You've just submitted your doctoral thesis despite an experience that you're describing as potentially crushing. So what is the turnaround? How do we accept the fact that some people, unfortunately, will pass through formal education with this cumulative effect of being treated like a failure for whatever reason? How did you, if you can draw on your personal experience, turn that around into actually a lifelong love of learning? So it's not entirely unsalvageable, but what's the secret?
Yeah, okay, so it is partly my personal experience, but also this is the experience of many others as well. And I know people who work in this field, and it's really, really interesting. It's kind of what you were talking about earlier. It's the environment. It's that nurturing sense of, we know that you can do certain things. And all right, you're not doing great on that, but let's celebrate your successes when you have a success. And let's create an environment where you feel comfortable and where you feel that you're not alienated from the learning experience. Because it's this sense of alienation, this sense of I shouldn't be here. This sense of okay, I'm here because I have to be here. I hate it. I find it tortuous. Everybody else seems to dislike me because I'm holding them all back. That kind of environment is the kind of environment that crushes spirits. So I was lucky. I grew up in a family which had, as it were, academic aspirations. My dad had been to university. My younger brother was always destined for university. My older brother was always destined for university. I wasn't. But there was that idea that you could go to university. And even after I left school with a handful of very mediocre, a very small handful of very mediocre A-levels, and that's including taking my 15, 16-year-old exams twice because I got D's and I needed a 3 C's to do my A-levels. Even after doing that, I still wasn't alienated from the idea that I could succeed in that world if I wanted to. And I was just very lucky. I was on an employment training scheme, learning how to learning how to word process, I think it was, or something. And I met somebody who was educated and was just taking a Maths O level at night school so she could go off and teach English or something. And she was the first adult who'd ever spoken to me and said, "You're intelligent." And that had such a transformative effect on my understanding of who I was. The fact that somebody was positive about it.
So it's time to wrap up this part of our conversation with Martin. And Martin finished up with a little anecdote that shows how far there is still to go, really.
A very important takeaway for all of us who are involved in helping others learn is to believe in their ability to learn and not to take certain, let's say, evidence of ability or inability in only one context, such as an exam, as the definition of their limits, their potential, and so on. So on the one hand, I'm happy for you that you were lucky, as you say. On the other hand, I'm sorry to hear that word luck, because it shouldn't just be about luck. Your ability to participate in learning should just be part of your human experience. And that strikes me as something really important for us to remember as learning designers, is that we are designing a whole experience. It's not just about content. It's about how that human being experiences the whole process, and at what point are they encouraged and supported, and how.
Well, to give you an example of what that could mean,
please.
I was talking to an 11, I think it's about 11 years old. I was talking to an 11-year-old boy fairly recently who was about to transition from primary school to state school, and he looked at me, and I genuinely, this stuck with me. I could see the fear and the anxiety in this 11-year-old's eyes, and he asked me, "Is secondary school going to be as bad as primary school?"
Wow.
And you think no child should be asking anybody that. No child should be that frightened at that age. And it just broke my heart, absolutely broke my heart. And the fact of the matter is, most of the time, yes, most of the time secondary school will be worse because there are more kids there. There are more demands on standardized testing. And so, and there's less allowance for play. And so I have to say that it depended on his teachers and it depended on his friends and the environment, and you can create a nice environment and all this kind of stuff. But the very fact of the matter is, I'm still worried that secondary school will be harder for him than primary school.
That's a fascinating insight, and I think it just speaks to how this can be a lifelong process of learning to learn, loving to learn, being supported or not. And I think there's a lot of insight in everything that you've just said for us to take away. So thank you so much. There's so many things that we could talk about in what the learner themselves bring to the learning experience, and I know we're just scraping the surface.
Adventures in Learning Design is brought to you by LearnJam. You can find out more about us and the work that we do at learnjam.com. And if you're interested to learn more about inclusive learning design and to download our ILXD dimensions, then head over to learnjam.com/resources.